So, Ubisoft are developing a Sands of Time remake, and while the game's been delayed due to mainly not looking as modern as we may have liked at the time of public reveal, recently a trophy list for the game was leaked showcasing what are going to be its likely achievements once it launches. It's an assumption to think this list is accurate, or the one that the final game will use, but in case it is real, it's a good sign to see all these achievements can be done in the original game. After thinking about that for a few minutes, and remembering that I still have 70 gigs of footage from this game on my hard drive, I realized I wanted to make a brief gameplay guide for Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time for people who are going to be picking up the remake and playing it when it comes out, hopefully in its much improved form, since it'll have a lot of similarities to the original game. I'll start by covering rewinds, then movement, then combat, and everything else. Rewinds are this game's most famous mechanic. If the white circle timer in the top left is reasonably full, you can rewind the previous few moments of gameplay and prevent whatever happened in them. You can rewind your own death, Farah's death, or unfavorable positioning. The dagger can only store the previous 10 seconds in memory, and the dagger's memory will reset whenever you leave a cutscene or retrieve a sand creature, so keep an eye on that circle and make sure you have some of it before trying anything. Now let's cover movement first, because it's what you'll be doing for most of your playtime. Also, some combat is skippable, but no movement is skippable, because of the nature of video games. For example, in order to move past a fight you don't want to engage with, well, that's exactly it, you have to move past it. So let's learn how to move. Running is pretty simple. You use it to get around on flat ground. Running off an edge will either drop you straight down if it's short enough, or have the prince drop into a ledge grab if the drop is too tall. Running towards short obstacles will automatically have the prince mantle onto them. Don't run on spike plates or you will get skewered. On a controller, you can gently tilt the analog stick to walk. On a keyboard, you can hold shift to walk instead. Walking on spike plates will prevent them from triggering, and this is how you get past a lot of them. Wall running is my favorite mechanic in the game. You can wall run up or wall run sideways, basically vertical and horizontal. Both are done with the interact button, which is usually right click or the right bumper. Horizontal wall runs have quite the distance on them, and you can release the button early to fall out of the wall run at a specific point you want. This can be used during speedruns in order to shortcut a certain section of the prison, for example. Letting an upward wall run finish completely without making contact with a grabbable ledge will cause the prince to finish off in a 180 backflip. There is a tech used in speedruns that involves releasing the wall run button at the very peak of a vertical wall run before the prince's backflip detaches him from the wall. It lets you get like a little bit of extra height than you thought was possible. This is hard to do, so for most players it's just going to be a novelty, but if you really want to practice it, it can be a bit useful. This lets you bypass certain areas by just wall running straight upward to a ledge, like here in the very beginning of the prologue. While running or walking, you can tap your jump button to roll. Rolling lets you dodge under certain traps like spinning blades, sliding wall swords, or swinging spiked logs. You can also use it to squeeze under a door that's almost closed. At short distances, spamming rolls is a little bit faster than running. When not moving, tap jump to hop straight up into the air. This is usually not very useful, but you can use it to grab parkour objects directly above you, like ledges, bars, and beams. You can also use it to dodge specific attacks targeted at your feet, like the Sand General sweeps. In the middle of a neutral jump like this, you can attack with your sword. Once again, not super useful, but you can get a free hit like this if you've just dodged a sweep. You can also kill time-frozen enemies with this once you uppercut them into the air with your launcher. On flat ground, you can only jump in a direction by tapping your roll or jump button while moving toward an edge. You have to be moving toward an edge. The remake might change this since it seems to be based on Forgotten Sands gameplay, and that game puts jump and roll on two separate buttons. Thin ledges that involve the prince pressing up against a wall and carefully moving along them can be wall run up to or grabbed by jumping at them. You can move left or right along them with your hands, or pull yourself up and move a little faster. If you take a hit of damage while standing on a thin ledge, you'll drop down to grab it. If you take a hit of damage while holding it, you'll fall off completely, so always pull yourself back up if you can. You can drop down, pull up, or jump higher from a thin ledge. And you can eject backwards away from the wall if there's something you want to reach behind the prince. You're going to be doing this a lot. Columns or pillars can be jumped at to grab them. You can climb up or down. You can also rotate around them, and when you press jump, you'll eject to whatever is behind the prince's back. This doesn't require a directional input, so you can just press jump. You can also quick jump from pillars by moving in a direction and tapping jump at the exact same time. With certain fixed camera angles, you might end up flinging yourself somewhere you didn't want to though, so if you don't feel confident, just slow rotate off of it instead. On bars, you can hold your interact button to rotate the prince around these, and tap jump to jump forward off of them. You can also turn around by tapping the direction opposite of the prince is facing. While you can rotate on bars all you want, it is a waste of time, since you can always time a jump input shortly after the prince grabs onto one to fling yourself forward immediately. Just get used to doing this and do it instead, since it's faster and it feels way better. Obviously you can also drop from them. Beams are basically like thin ledges, and sometimes they're even connected to them or extend off of them, but beams are free floating above empty space, so the prince moves slower on them and has to be careful not to lose his balance. You can do the same things on them that you can do on thin ledges otherwise though. Let's talk about combat and time powers. Most of the time powers in Sands of Time are associated with combat, so they're going in the combat section, but that aside, there are a number of useful fighting moves you should understand. Ground Retrieve. All humanoid sand creatures knocked to the ground must be destroyed by retrieving the Sands of Time inside their bodies using the Dagger. If you leave them on the ground, they will always get back up. You can use this time to focus on other enemies, but it's usually best to eliminate them when you get the chance. Holding your interact button with your sword out will let you block. You almost never want to do this, but it is helpful to avoid damage from scarabs or birds, or the occasional enemy attack that you can't get out of the way of. The reason you don't want to block is that putting your guard up will actually make enemies more aggressive. This isn't too harsh, but it is noticeable if you pay attention. So instead, you want to be as offensive as you can, so they stand around more often. You can sword counter to knock an enemy down, or dagger counter to retrieve them, by holding block, then tapping attack at the moment their weapon clashes with yours. This is hard to time while you're still learning it, but if you practice, you'll get good at it. Enemies later in the game can counter your counter, and you can enter what's known as a back and forth counter dance if you get unlucky enough. Pass the counter back and forth enough times, and yours will eventually get through. While you cannot block sweeps from generals or blacksmiths, you can counter them if you time it right. This is one of the only ways to avoid damage from them without moving out of the attack's way or jumping it. Mashing sword will cause the prince to do a basic sword combo. This looks cool as hell when you're just standing around not hitting anything, and against enemies that can't block, like human guards or scarabs. But this is where its usefulness ends for the most part. I don't recommend playing with sword combos because sand creatures will randomly and suddenly block them, and that feels awful and can lead to you eating damage. Just don't, unless you really want to. You can vault an enemy by pushing toward them and pressing jump with your sword out. Vaulting an enemy is a good way to get out of a situation, like when you're surrounded, or to quickly move to the other side so you can finish another foe. You can attack in the middle of vaults too, with a variety of simple combos. Vault sword sword causes a knockdown. On human enemies in the prologue, this is an instant kill. Vault sword dagger is a vault finisher or quick retrieve. It automatically defeats any sand creature susceptible to being vaulted. Vault dagger sword freezes the enemy and cuts them in half, annihilating them. This is an instant kill on any sand creature susceptible to vaulting, but it's also a little inefficient. You can do it if you want to look cool. Blue enemies cannot be vaulted. They will counter the attempt, cut you down, and you'll take damage if you try. This is not the case if you activate slow motion though, also known as the power of delay, which we'll talk about later. Now, let's cover wall interactions. Wall interactions will save your life against enemies that counter vaults. Being close to a wall and pressing jump into it so the prince steps on it like this lets you press jump, sword, or dagger to do a different action. You gotta have your sword out to do this though. Wall rebounds are done with jump jump. The prince will rebound off the wall and sail down behind an enemy's back, similarly to vaulting over them. All of the same things you can do from a vault, you can also do from a wall rebound. Torpedo attacks are done with jump sword. The prince will eject off the wall aggressively and spike himself into the enemy, causing an instant knockdown if the attack isn't blocked. You can retrieve them then, or leave them on the ground while focusing on other enemies. Torpedo freezes are done with jump dagger. The prince will eject off the wall just like in a normal torpedo attack and stab an enemy with a dagger, freezing them. You can do the same things you can do from a normal restraint stab from here, and let's cover what those are. The power of restraint, or the dagger stab, lets you burn one power tank to freeze an enemy in place. Launching them into the air lets you cut them in half and destroy them utterly. This is one way to bypass having to retrieve them. This leaves you standing still though, so if you insist on killing a frozen enemy without a retrieve, it's better to freeze vault sword instead. This way you stack a movement action on top of a kill action and keep yourself safer. You can also hit them with your launcher and then just let them fall down in order to retrieve them after. This is a bit more efficient because you get to take back half of your used power tank. Launching a frozen foe lets you focus on other enemies and gives you even more time than just leaving them on the ground, so this is a great strategy for managing big fights. Freeze one or two, and you have tons of time to deal with a few others. Tapping your rewind button instead of holding it slips the world into slow motion. Everything will move slower, including the prince. This also prevents blues, such as blue spearmen or generals, from countering your vault attacks. Very useful for opening them up to an already broken dominant strategy. Haste, or the Mega Freeze, can be done by holding block then tapping rewind. It essentially freezes all enemies in the area as if you had stabbed them each with the dagger one by one, and lets you warp between them instantly. New enemies that spawn into the combat space will be automatically frozen as well. Mega Freeze lasts until the green circle timer makes a full rotation. A good way to finish a Mega Freeze is by launching all enemies and letting them fall to the ground as the Mega Freeze ends. That way, you can retrieve some of them and take back some of your sand. Enemies who are slumped over like this are susceptible to a free knockdown. You can slash them with your sword, let Farah hit them with an arrow, or vault over them, and each of these actions will all spike them into the ground. Make sure they're struck fast though, because slumped over enemies will get back up soon. Since blacksmiths have an irregular hitbox that causes vault sword knockdowns to whiff on them sometimes, it can be better to just do the first hit until they slump, and then knock them down in a manner of your choosing. This is up to you though, since other times the vault knockdown hits just fine. It's a bit random. The prince can hold interact to drink from water fountains, bathwater, or waterfalls, among other sources of water around Azad, in order to heal his damaged health bar. Healing takes time, so while you can do it in the middle of a fight, it is a risk. Retrieving a sand cloud will refill all of your sand tanks and power tanks, while building a small bit of your next sand tank. Avoiding sand clouds will cause you to have Mega Freeze online more often, but limit your available sand tanks and power tanks. It's a risk-reward decision, because you can sacrifice having more individual uses of time powers, like freezes and rewinds, to give yourself more frequent access to your ultimate skill instead. Sometimes the prince can encounter strange ethereal hallways throughout Azad, marked by magical sounding music, which lead to a mystical realm. Drinking from the magic fountain in this place's core whenever you reach it will extend the prince's maximum health, lengthening his health bar. There are several mandatory sword upgrades you must collect over the course of the game. Each one will cause your combos to down enemies with fewer hits, kill scarabs with fewer hits, and allow you to begin shattering through structurally weak walls throughout Azad. That's it for this overview of Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time's gameplay. These are the things you need to know most in order to enjoy this game, as it was intended by the developers. If you're looking for information on first-person glitch, zips, and other specific speedrun strategies, I recommend checking out the /r Prince of Persia subreddit and clicking on the Discord link there to engage with the game's speedrunning community. Thank you so much for watching, and may the night keep you safe.